Hello, everyone. You're listening to the 805 Uncensored. We are a show on the Anti Capitalist Podcast Network hosted by three leftists. This podcast covers a variety of topics from music to politics, news, philosophy, and more. There are no limits, which is why we are uncensored. So, welcome. Please follow us on your podcast and social media platforms of choice. This is episode number 101. And today on the show, we have Shirin. Would you like to
Hey,
introduce
how's it going?
yourself for our listeners?
So I like to say my name's Shirin. It means sweet in Farsi. I'm an Iranian artist and dissident. Left Iran when I was about 9 years old. I've had a bunch of political drama in my family over time. And since I've been in the US and the Woman Life Freedom movement started, it woke that up in my heart. And I've done whatever I can to help be the voice of the people back home and kind of translate over that news so that, it does come across since it's repressed. And so I host Freedom Hour Iran on WXOX, which is a community radio channel out of Louisville, Kentucky. But also, I try to get on Spotify, on Instagram, anywhere that I can to try to amplify that news and get it out there. There aren't a lot of resources where the news is translated in English. So to try to get it out of that silo and that echo chamber, Freedom Hour Iran was born. So happy to be here and happy to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, we're thrilled to talk to you, and I was so glad to find your channel on Instagram and come across your content. You don't find too many people, um, that are from Iran that are able to speak on these topics. So it's nice to get your perspective as somebody that lived there and as somebody that's been all around the world and has stayed in the United States as well. I actually want to make a little brief correction. I said episode 101, but this is episode 102.
Ooh.
So,
I was there for 101. It's okay.
my understanding is you politically identify as an anarchist. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about your definition of anarchism and specifically about the roots of Iranian anarchism?
Yeah, so I think anarchy, along with a lot of other ideologies, especially far left leaning ones, get a lot of bad rep. So I've gotten a lot of interesting commentary from both sides of the world about identifying as an anarchist. But I think this is a great part of the conversation to begin, because a lot of people that assume they know what anarchy is just think that it's a complete lack of order, you know, terroristically, just lack of any sort of system in place, a state of disorder, basically. But for me, anarchy has always just been something that stemmed from growing up in an environment where critical thinking was a huge aspect of my household, of our ideologies, and it was a lot of breakdown of thought, breakdown of things that are presented to you. So organized religion is presented to you, okay, but why, who's presenting it, how is it being presented, what are the results, what are the actions, do they match the words? So it was always a breakdown of things that are happening in order to see if it even you know is good for me, let alone how I should even move forward from there on out. So for me, anarchy stemmed from just a way of thinking and a way of living and growing up, which I'm very thankful for, because I can't say a lot of people in more conservative parts of the world have that opportunity. But it's not anarchist extremism. In my ideal world, do I think that we should all have little communities and we just live how we want? Absolutely. But I also believe that when there's a system that doesn't behoove you anymore, you should be able to break that down and just take the parts that would actually function for you and move forward with a system just right for you. So I think for me, anarchy is just kind of like a way of thought. So it applies to different things for me, to relationships, to the way of thinking, to politics. Um, so when I'm met with backlashes of, oh, well, if you're an anarchist, you know nothing about Iranian history, or, you must be a supporter of the regime, or it's because of people like you or the far left that any of this even happened. It really puts into light the fact that similar understanding of anarchy isn't shared. And so, you do a quick Google search and you see the FBI's definition of like anarchist extremism, and there should be, society with no government, no laws, no police, no authority. It's perfectly legal for everybody to just do whatever they want. But you start parsing through that and you realize that it's very similar to other leftist ideologies. And it's a lot of the reason why a lot of Iranians that think that what they hear, the propaganda that they're given, the indoctrination that they're given, um, is true. And it's because of leftists and anarchists and freedom fighters that we even got to where we are, and we got the regime to begin with. So it's a very personal thing for me to say that I'm an anarchist, because it applies to so many different things. But it is definitely something that, despite what I've heard some people say is prevalent in Iranian culture, we see a lot of political dissidents and political activists. So um, I think it's just a very hard label to put on things and then not be able to point out those little, discrepancies in thought.
Yeah, and I think you're really just getting at the nature of anarchism, that it's about the abolition of unjustified hierarchy and getting to the root of our problems, because my understanding of anarchism is every force of power that exists in society has to justify itself, otherwise it ought to be dismantled and abolished. And I think your comment that, from other Iranians hearing you being a supporter of anarchism, they're equating that with you being opposed to the, or you supporting the regime rather, is really interesting, because there's not many more repressive regimes around the world that I can think of, especially for women, and we'll talk more about the patriarchy later in the episode, um, than the one in Iran. So that's very interesting to me.
Maybe Afghanistan, but that's kind of a ripple effect kind of situation. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, so this kind of this goes well into my next segment, which is about protests and the patriarchy. Can you talk about the September 13th, 2022 arrest and subsequent murder of 22-year-old Masa Amini by the Iranian Guidance Patrol, also known as the Morality Police, the protests that surrounded the murder, and the brutal crushing of dissent by the Iranian police?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is similar to something that we talk in parallels with what's happening, with Israel and Palestine, where, the genocide's been happening for a while. It's just been happening in a smaller trickle, and now we're seeing it full force. This has been happening for a very long time, and since the regime took over, people have been dissenting and trying to speak out, but subsequently, have to leave the country or are executed or whatever it is that ends up happening. Um, However, in 2022, when Gina Massa Amini, who is an ethnic minority, came from a smaller region, an ethnic region of Iran to visit, she's of Kurdish origin. Um, she was wearing her headdress as she's supposed to, her hijab as she's supposed to, with some hair showing. We've seen pictures of it. It's nothing that's unprecedented from just like an everyday, hijab wearing female in Iran. And she was taken so violently that she, had head injuries, ended up falling into a coma, collapsing in custody, falling into a coma, and then, passing away. And that really was a spark that I think that younger generation really needed to get out there and say, okay, that's enough. We don't have anything left, but we have the only thing we have our lives, and now you're taking that from us too for no reason. So it really lit a fire to, I think, the little flame that was already underneath everything, waiting to come out. And since then, it's been kids anywhere between, you've seen 12-year-olds to people in their 80s, but mainly students out in the streets fighting and getting maimed and shot and attacked and disappearing, um, receiving death sentences. So it's only amplified. It's only amplified. And we see that it's amplified, especially in minority regions. So a lot of times, when we're talking about the executions or the disappearances, it's always about Baha'is or the Kurds or the Baluchis, and it's very heavily targeted. Just like, we target minority groups here first when we're trying to pull back freedoms. over there they target minorities because they know no, people aren't fighting for them as much. They're on their own, they're smaller groups, easier to pick off. No one's done anything about it until now, so but they're also the majority of the people that have been fighting for freedoms before the revolution, after the revolution, and continue to be targeted. And so I think it's interesting that Massa Jina Amini, Jina being her Kurdish name, became the symbol for the revolution. Um, However, you start seeing other parallels too, where a lot of people are happy to call it a woman life freedom movement and a revolution in Iran. And thank you to Massa Jina Amini, but they're not also supporting the ethnic minorities that are fighting for the same freedoms and rights. So it's been a very excuse me, turbulent movement with a lot of friction and still happening. So I'm glad that the conversations are still happening, but it doesn't seem like the international community has taken to necessarily talking about it as much as it needs to where there's actual pressure applied externally from outside countries. So it's only getting worse, to put it lightly.
So this, to me, sounds similar to the George Floyd murder in the United States. Was that kind of um, a similar vibe in Iran when she was killed?
Um, I would say similar to that, except you know how here we were saying, oh, we have to protest peacefully, like you guys are rioting. We broke our free windows. It was way different there. I mean, there were cars flipped over on fire. There were young girls who were 16 years old holding their headscarf, setting it on fire. And all of those girls, unfortunately, were identified and taken, and many of them killed. Um, so a lot more violent, a lot more direct one-on-one. Um, and it didn't really die down the way that all of those movements have died down. I mean, we even saw, I lived in Kentucky for a while with Breonna Taylor. For a long time, there were people in the streets, and people were kind of face to face with the authorities. But then it kind of died down. And the next time that somebody um, that it happened to, we didn't really see anybody out in the streets and so on. Except in Iran, I will say that anytime, unfortunately, that it does happen and we see a new martyr, it kind of like is new fuel to the fire, to the flame. So in a little different in that in the US, we're being desensitized over time with it happening. Meanwhile, in Iran, the kids are using it as a tool of kind of getting the revolution to keep going, keep rolling.
Yeah, I think I read that over 500 people were killed by the police
Uh,
in these protests. Is that accurate?
a lot more.
Yeah, that
There were a
was what was
lot more killed.
reported.
Yeah, there were a lot more killed and continue to be killed. So it's kind of hard to say, was it the first day? Was it the third day? Was it the second week? There are children being killed. There were bodies being found in hillsides. Parents weren't hearing from their children and didn't know where they were. So it was quite a bit of misinformation that was being spread. And, the regime has done a good job of infiltrating a lot of external systems as well, where they will put people in place who work to minimize this information, minimize everything. Oh, it's just, girls in Iran without their hijabs. Look, they're going out with their hair out. It's fine. Or the girls just want to be naked in the streets. This is just da da da. But it's a lot more than that. So that minimization, unfortunately, has done a lot of damage and just kind of kept it, in the conversation of, oh well, it's just the Middle East. Oh well, they're just terrible to women. Meanwhile, it keeps getting worse.
Yeah, I think I just saw oh yeah, go ahead, Heather. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna ask, like, what role you mentioned that the international community hasn't really spoken up about it to the extent that you would like to have seen or heard. And I'm wondering what role, I mean, perhaps this is like really obvious, but what role is, like racism and Islamophobia, um, do you think is playing, like, is that, do you think that's why?
There's a huge part of it. There's a huge part, and I don't think it's Islamophobia as much as it is just the bigotry and the racism. It's just like we see in Palestine. The images look the exact same to me. And that's why I don't understand it. That's brown children, intense, hungry, without shoes. Meanwhile, the mullahs families are overseas in Canada on party boats making fun of everybody. It's this unfortunate parallel that you're seeing, and then overseas we're not seeing that kind of condemnation of it happening by average people. You see the occasional kind of political nod to, oh yeah, you guys, human rights, it's doing terrible. Let's slap some sanctions on you. But that's really all performance. And so it's not, it seems like it's just a placating, oh, we did something, but it's not actually anything that's helping. And over time, sanctions are complicated. All that's doing is making the poor people poorer and poorer and poorer, while not applying enough pressure to actually get the government to either, which you guys know I have a complicated relationship with the word reform, but to either stop executing their own people or GTFO. So it seems like the international community are not concerned enough to get anyone to actually make any moves. And, when all of this started, a lot of us felt abandoned, even as leftists in the West who are surrounded by feminists, are surrounded by other activists, felt super super alone and abandoned because nobody else was really talking about it. And so I think it's just continued that way, and it's felt a little hopeless, to say the least.
And I think to your point about the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests kind of dying out, I think that is more of just that, a lot of people just don't like, they care, but they don't, and a lot of people end up feeling helpless because, when everybody's lost interest in, the BLM, you know, protests and, going down to City Hall and, waving your little, uh, you know, posters and, all the performance, right? When that's over, like, they go home, but there's still like the Black community is like, but wait, right? Like, hello, we're still being killed. Like, and so I think that uh, there's a parallel there in that feeling alone, just isolated.
Exactly.
Yeah, I saw a video of a woman that took off her clothes in Iran the other day and stood on that car. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, I love it. Here for it. It's a lot of times these women, unfortunately, their stories are not coming out, or when it does, it's framed as, oh, look, mental health care patient. And so it's happened a couple of times now, and because it draws so much attention internationally, they're now writing it off as psychological issues, and they've started um, throwing money into this mental health care facility, bunny quotes, mental health care facility for these women. So we're reverting back to like the 50s and 60s. Oh, you're upset? It's just mental health issues. So just like a blanket thing now to just start blaming women with, because they're noticing that women are like the individual that, I think it was the one that was on the police car, correct? Yes. Before her, a couple months ago, there was another woman who got down to just her underwear and was walking around a campus just with her arms crossed, middle of winter. And so, they're seeing this trend and it's getting the attention of international populations. So now it's a mental health thing. So they write it off. And I've actually seen people fall for it. I've seen the videos come out and people say, oh, well, they were just saying she's crazy. She just lost it. It's nothing like that. She's getting medical care. So it's very easy to spin that. And that's what's happening. But the women are getting to a point where they're suffocated, more than suffocated. We're seeing everything from, them being killed at the hands of fathers and husbands they're trying to divorce to, being put away for saying that they want to have bodily autonomy or whatever it is. So it's I wouldn't be surprised to see more of that, um, especially because it's getting international attention.
What is going on with the student protests in Tehran?
So the students have always been, as a lot of students all over the world, some of the first to protest, and they have been poisoned by the regime. They have been heavily targeted, um, and they're amplifying security on their campuses or around the city. But what they're not doing is not actually protecting the students because that wouldn't behoove them. So the students are noticing that not only do they have no future, great, they're in school, what are they going to do afterwards? You're not going to be able to afford to have a family. You're not going to be able to afford to, live the life that you want. Um, they're seeing that on top of that, their actual lives are in danger now. The regime is investing money into security forces as an excuse to keep amplifying that, military power and security around campuses in the city to quash that uprising. But they're not doing it in order to keep students safe otherwise. So that's kind of really fueling that fire. And then we're seeing when students stand up, other little groups will start coming together, making big groups and standing up with them. There was a student that was killed on campus, a 19-year-old, a couple of weeks ago, and there have been nonstop uprisings since, different campuses joining in as well. And then aside from that, there was a young woman who was stabbed on a bridge and killed, who was a young student. So it's just, I think, downside to what's happening is that we're losing these beautiful individuals. Upside is more individuals are seeing that it could happen to them at any moment, even if they're not in the protests. If they're just existing on campus, they're still in danger. If they're just existing out and about with just a little bit of hair out, they're still in danger. So hopefully that momentum will keep going, but it's been one of the bigger student uprisings that I've seen in a moment.
Would you say that in general, there's an extremely contentious relationship between the Iranian people and the state, or is it more generational? Whereas older people have more trust in the regime, and then younger people see that there's really not much of a future for them, to your point. So they're highly incentivized to really put their lives on the line.
That's actually a great question. So what you're seeing is the older generations, there are still a lot that are active. Um, Mainly what it is that a lot of them fought in their generation, and then after a while started having families and started having to deal with the systems. So I know a lot of people in the older generation that were fighting, but have just, if you will, retired. Majority of the people that do believe in the regime that support it are either benefiting somehow or they're extremely conservative to a very um, MAGA kind of way, if you will. It's very similar, interestingly enough. Um, but they are, they believe that they're doing whether it's religious work and making sure that they're keeping their country, um, you know, from getting too westernized, if you will, or whether it is, oh, they're benefiting because there's more food on their table because they do what the regime says. There's an interesting film that came out that was up for international film nominations called Seed of the Seed of the Soil. Let me look that up. But um, Seed of the Sacred Fig. Yes, there we go. Seed of the Sacred Fig. And it beautifully depicts um, the kind of parallels with the younger generation and how much easier it is for them to kind of, understand what's happening and fall into the revolution, and the older generation and their conservatism and where they kind of come from trying to make their family survive. So it's very convoluted, but the people that you see that are regime sympathizers and supporters definitely benefiting for the most part. And you see that huge divide where they have money and they've got, their kids all of a sudden have positions in government or easier to find jobs and getting schools. Meanwhile, you've got the more disenfranchised that continue to take a loss. You're still on mute.
Boomer alert. Can you speak on the patriarchy, gender based violence, oppression, and the struggle for women inside Iran? And the second part of that question is, can you talk about what life was like for Iranian women before the revolution of 79 and what it looks like today?
Absolutely. So, as far as the patriarchy goes, out of control. Honestly, it's anytime you see any government entity come for women first, it's because women throughout the history of time have been backbone of a lot of movements and revolutions, including especially in Iran. So, coming for women first and taking down that, um, not just the builder of community, but the people who have spoken up. Students, women, the educated, they came for those people first. And as far as heavily targeting women, as far as continuing to take away powers, for example, if you see in Afghanistan, women aren't allowed to talk in public anymore. I mean, it's Handmaid's Tale to a T. That is what they wish they could do in Iran. They have referenced the mullahs that women are less than cattle. So it's this not just a way of control, but also of instilling this cultural mindset into other men in other patriarchal systems within the country to then also perform that oppression on the women, creating that kind of they're less than, they're your property, whatever it is. And you see a lot of that in the smaller villages, and thankfully, a lot of the more educated individuals in the bigger cities don't behave that way, and it's have more of a westernized outlook, but it's enough to where you still see surging numbers of femicide, and you see how women are attacked by average people who are conservative in the street for showing their hair and wearing skin tight clothes. So it's very heavily women targeted, but it is also everything else. So I think something that's beautiful that came out of women life freedom, which I should note, stemmed off of the Kurdish ethnic movement of Jinjian Azadi, which is woman life freedom. Basically, when it came about, instilled this. It's yes, it's women, but it's life and freedom everywhere. Because if there's any state or any entity that doesn't value women, then they don't value life and they don't value freedom. So that's where it starts. And so this beautiful thing came about from this patriarchal, control, that many of us were hoping would then take over, and you would hear conversations of free the women, free, freedom in Iran, and then we'll take over the rest. We'll get everybody else, on the same page. So it's been a beautiful thing that started, but of course, as you guys know, a lot of bad people come in and dilute that and change a lot of the conversation along the way. So it's only gotten a little more convoluted and unfortunately a little selfish along the way. Um, what was the second part of the question? I'm so sorry.
Oh yeah, no problem. It was a long question. I wanted to ask you what life was like for Iranian women before the revolution, um, as opposed to now.
Yeah. So Iran was um, has been for a long time largely Muslim population, um, and the smaller parts of the country definitely were more religious and practiced more diligently. And so you would have a lot of women that still adhere to a lot of more of those traditional, if you will, conservative roles, covered up a little more when men are around, but it was still a little more, your personal religion, your choice. Maybe it's just the little society that you were in, but it wasn't a, you know, largely patriarchal, systematic, government-based oppression. My mom was wearing, I mean, I've seen pictures of her hair down her back, out, makeup, in a mini skirt with high heels with her friends, women in bikinis on the same beaches as men, women in the government wearing beautiful little, skirt suits. So women were free to have that bodily autonomy. And while there was some sense of conservatism still to the country, there was that freedom for women. So it's come a long way, from my mother wearing mini skirts to me at the age of 7 going to first grade covering everything but my face hole is just very, very stark and very quick. So it changed rapidly.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the photos that I've seen from Kabul from the 1970s, as opposed to the current climate in Afghanistan under the Taliban, which has really taken hold since the 90s.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we helped take down the Taliban just to shake hands with a new version, just to, oh, so you guys won't play ball, but this version 2.0 will. And that's unfortunately what you're seeing with Iran. I mean, the US and the West had a big hand in what happened with the coup in Iran. And granted, the pressure was already there. There were a lot of disenfranchised parts of the community that felt they were kept poor intentionally. Resources were not being given to them while they were being heavily poured into, you know, the rich and the monarchy, French Revolution, if you will. And all of these people just happened to be more conservative as well. And so you had this change where they were the ones fighting for freedom, kind of like opened that entryway, and then Western influence. Let's put someone in power that will give us what we want, that will,
Hmm.
that will share resources with us. So there was a lot of catalysts, but I think a huge part of it was um, that kind of conservatives and people that were the religious and ethnic minorities feeling stepped on.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the MAGA movement with regard to conservatism in Iran, because I've actually thought about this a long time. The MAGA movement would have a lot in common with the Taliban. If you told them that, they would argue, but you could go over a long list of things where they see eye to eye, especially as it relates to their views towards women.
It's interesting where it stems from. Um, if you don't even go that far into it, there's this weird comfort in dictatorship or fascism. I'm not really sure what it
Authoritarianism,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, there's this weird comfort in it, and you see people that didn't want the monarchy in place, but then they very easily signed over to a new master, another dictatorship. But then there are people that are fighting the current dictatorship, and as soon as they see that you know President Trump is shaking hands with the exiled prince, they're ready to jump ship and climb on top of every other disenfranchised person just to get that little bit of good that they had before, just because it was good for them. So it's very similar to that mega conservative. I want to go back to the good old days because it was good for me, and that's all that matters. And it's translating over in a weird way to a lot of Trump supporters in the US that are Iranian, um, and people that are now attacking anyone who's basically saying they don't want a monarchy in Iran, but instead they want an actual, secular democracy. So it's been a very interesting movement, and we've seen so much separation. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. So
Audra, Heather, do you have any questions before I move on to Palestine?
Yeah, hi. I totally forgot how to raise my hand. I forget which platform I'm on. Hi, Audra here. Sorry I was late. Yeah, I was jumping down a rabbit hole researching some aliens, and I was like, oh shit, I'm 30 minutes late behind this call. Hello. So, when I never met another person from Iran when I was living in America. I often got Iran and Iraq confused. I couldn't point either country out on a map, whatever. I couldn't even tell you where the Netherlands was until I actually rolled up on the doorstep and moved in with my boyfriend who lived here. So, when I first met my first Iranian, I was like, wow, I've never met anyone from Iran because it was such a unique moment for me, right? Um, and then I started noticing a theme because I was meeting a lot of Iranians, but they were all women, and a lot of them were here with their husbands because their husbands were working here on an assignment, and so they were here and they weren't necessarily working, but they had interest and volunteership. And so I'm a part in my community here in Holland. I'm a part of various different groups where there's a lot of female entrepreneurial spirit, and these women would show up, and so I would meet maybe a handful a year or so of Iranian women, and they are always quite shy and reserved. And there's me. I'm like, tell me everything. Tell me what it was like. I need to know everything. And of course I come at them and they're like, "Oh, you're American," and often we're treated as Americans to be super friendly. So people are really excited to talk to us because we're just always so friendly. But when you talk to somebody from the Middle East or who's Muslim, sometimes you get different responses, right? So there is still this vibe that it's weird. What's it called? American exceptionalism. Like we are better than anyone else because we were the ones that stopped World War II. And so there's this superiority complex that Americans have. And I only became super aware of that about 5 years into living abroad. So when I started traveling and working in Muslim countries, I became hypersensitive and I would be like, people would ask me, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "England." And they're like, "You don't sound English." I'm like, "Okay, all right, well, I'm American." And they're like, "Oh, why didn't you just tell me that?" I'm like, "Because you're Egyptian, and I'm sorry."
Say
I'm
Canadian.
That's the common one
Canadian.
these days, yeah.
Yeah, I had never met a Canadian while I was living in America. Now I know hundreds, but like I'm from the Midwest. Like we are really, and then after I left Missouri, I moved to Colorado. So like my diversity bubble was very, very small until after I left America. So I just didn't have these life experiences. So now I have a lot of Canadian friends, and yeah, I should just use that. I'm Canadian. Um but yeah, it's an interesting conversation to be having because I just can't conceptualize a lot of what was happening 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's just not a part of history that I learned in school. So I only learned more about the history of Iran only like after moving here and studying and watching the news because our news headlines are focused on different things over here in Europe. So yeah, I will say that right now, I used to work in oil and gas and shipping. And so when I would work in the Middle East, I could slowly see over the last decade the rise in Western culture that was influencing the Middle East. So, like right now, when you go to Dubai, it's like a mini Las Vegas, right? It does not feel like a Middle Eastern country. Even if you go to the old parts, it's just loaded with tourism. So, Qatar has its own little bubble, Abu Dhabi as well. So, you've got all of these like pop up US style cities. And for instance, in Dubai, a city that is completely built off of the backs of slaves willingly, um, it's it's just another capitalistic model that is not really sustainable, but they've just got a shitload of money. So I really foresee a lot of Americans wanting to flock to the Middle East and a lot of companies wanting to move and relocate to the Middle East. The Middle East is a supercell right now for building power, and they've got a lot to give and a lot to offer because they still have oil, tons of it. So, we cannot underestimate what's gonna happen in the coming century in the Middle East. Yeah. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, you made me think of all the mega projects that are going on in Saudi Arabia right now, built on slave labor, and the thousands of people that have died and also just have disappeared, primarily people from Bangladesh.
And the resources they use too. I know a lot of the resources that were used, for example, in Dubai are resources that were basically taken for dirt cheap from other countries in the Middle East. So it's definitely very colonialist for sure.
Yeah, and it's also, you have the m the Muslim culture of the polarity. So, like, when you go to Dubai, you have the Middle Eastern people that are native, but you don't see very many people that are from Dubai itself, right? Like,
Hmm.
they've already moved to the outside of the city, and they're living in their little tribes surrounding the city. Um, but it's different that and I don't want to sound discriminating here, but you've got like when I was riding in the Ubers and the taxis with the natives, they treat each other differently than Westerners. Like, inshallah, and we're gonna drive really, really fast and tailgate this person and slam on our brakes. I'm like, oh my gosh, you have a car full of Westerners and you're being paid to drive us for safety and security. And yet, no, you don't need a seatbelt here. We don't wear seatbelts here. I'm like, inshallah. So it's mixing these two cultures that have very different ideologies. So I'm really anxious to see how that will influence American culture with the rise and the popularity of what's coming out of Dubai. I mean, talk about Saudi Arabia, the whole Nome line. Do you guys know this project? It's quite an impressive deal, and it's just another little miniature America that's just popping up in the middle of the desert.
So I guess if I may, where do you guys feel, because I think there's a lot of the conversation around extremism is very, very interesting right now, because while countries like America are saying, oh, look at these extremists on the left, they're also veering towards a very extreme. And then you've got Islamic extremism that really tries to pull in the rest of the world too. So there's this weird parallel. Do you guys think that people are going to pull towards those Middle Eastern countries? And like, how do you think that blame, because there's a lot of blame on leftists, and a lot of times people saying, oh well, all leftists are Hamas supporters, all leftists are supporters of this the regime. I've seen people say, on the left, that, oh, thank goodness the Islamic Republic regime is bombing Israel, like they're our ally. And there's this kind of like, I think the conversation's intentionally being muddled, but where do you guys think that's going to play in, like, the two different polar opposites of extremism and how they're coming together?
So first of all, the show that I was talking to you guys about before we started recording, 0 Day, it just dropped on Netflix. And what's so funny about this show, it's like a limited 6-part fictional, drama. And basically the US is attacked, and who is blamed? Radical leftists. It's so funny because it's like such as like a stereotype at this point, right? To just blame, quote unquote extremist groups. I don't want to like give any spoilers for anyone that's listening and wants to watch it, but in the end, there's a huge like scene or discussion around how like the world is different now, and it's all built on extremes, pitted against this, common sense middle ground, right? And everybody's either an extreme white nationalist, right winger, or a left wing anarchist with a pipe bomb, right? So that's that's what's depicted in this film. And as we're talking about Dubai, and this kind of idea that of extremism, right? I have a friend from childhood who he's a tech entrepreneur. He's formed and sold off multi-million dollar um, uh, software companies to Oracle, and he travels to Dubai all the time. And it is stunning to see his um, uh it's like he gets to Dubai and he's mystified. And it's like he wants to move there. He wants to uproot his family and move there. To your point, Audra, about this fascination with this new tech, uh beautiful city, everything is gold, and I just think I think that's kind of like I wanted to say that it's so colonial of us, right? To find a new flashy place that looks nice and pretty, and everyone wants to take it. But to the point about extremism, I just, I think that's more of the same. An easy scapegoat is anyone who dissents from popular opinion. and that's an easy person to blame. I'm not blaming, terrorist groups, that have, like jihadists that have attacked and murdered people or anything like that. But um, yeah, what the U.S. used to be on. Yeah, exactly. The US did used to be the US. Think about like when you read these historical accounts of like people coming to America and finding these palatial green forests and land of opportunity. There was so much land, and you had all this beautiful glimmery. Like that's how it's portrayed in the history books. And when you're talking about a place like Dubai, and I think about my friend Vic, who, I mean, he's been a very successful CEO of some of these companies, and he goes over there and he acts like he's, a pioneer, a so-called pioneer coming to America for the first time. But all he sees is gold, because that's what I think of when I think of Dubai, is those gold buildings, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a it's a little scary to think about the fact that people would be. I mean, once you get to a place where if America is not offering people the healthcare, the comfortable life, whatever it is, people will leave, and people
Yeah.
are leaving. And it's unfortunate that it's so easy to fall for systems like that that are, you said, set up very much like America. I mean, like Dubai, not only, like we said, was built on all these terrible things, but they also benefit from, sex trade and things like
Yeah.
that. So they, actively go to other countries in the Middle East and will take women, children. So, we would just be legitimizing it further and further. But then you've got both sides of the world pitting each other against each other as far as extremism. You've got people in the Middle East and in Iran. For example, in Iran, a lot of people are pitted against leftists. Over here, a lot of people are being pitted against leftists. I remember, there specifically people from the right will send people to leftist movements to act extremist just to push their agenda. So it's this like really strange back and forth, and I'm just curious to see um, what exactly is the work what they're working with here, because I think the U.S. is using this as a way of pushing into more Christian conservatism, and I mean they just developed a faith office and they're going to be prosecuting any non-Christian activity or whatever it is, so, or anti-Christian activity. So I feel like they're using it as a means of um, also terrifying people to think, look, if we don't push away from this extremism, then we'll be just like them. And it's just, it's such an, I'm not sure if they're doing it just to kind of get everyone really at each other, to push their, all of the above. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's an issue of control.
Yeah.
It's easier to control people. It's easier to control people. It's easier to control votes. It's easier to push your quote unquote reforms or legislation or policies, if it's easier to control all of that if you have scapegoated large groups of people and reduced the people that actually have input to a very small group in power.
Like our immigration laws, illegal immigration laws that we're doing, and all the different bills. I mean, it's really interesting that the parallels between here and Iran. It's all these things that are presented as conservative means of making something that's not working better, but really all those subtitles and clickbaits have all these little points underneath them that people aren't looking at or considering. And obviously we know it didn't take Nazi Germany very long, but it also didn't take Iran very long, or other countries very long. It's a quick fall. And I think if more people were to actually look at world history as opposed to just what happened here in the past like 200 plus years, they might be a little bit more worried.
Yeah, definitely.
Exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head
Recency
because
bias.
yeah, exactly. When I fire up my friends in America, "How are you doing?" They're like, yeah, everything's fine, you know, da, da, da. I'm like, no, really, how are you doing? And they're like, you're over sensationalizing this. You're really worried. And no, I've been on this
We're
train for the last
doomed.
decade. No, I really don't think so. I mean, I think that we are on a train towards Doomsville, but I don't think that we are doomed, because no point in history have we ever doomed out. Like, we're still here, evolving. Now, do I think it's going to get worse? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And when I study the astrology, what the transits that are happening during USA's Pluto return, which is happening now, specifically are heavy for 2026 and 27. And I do think that there's going to be some global events that are tying into that. We already see a Russian US alliance forming. What the fuck? You know? So I really do think that we are at a place where people are at that level of doneness that they're ready for the crazy. But then there's a certain amount of people that are just that level of crazy is driving them crazy. So we feel this energetic heaviness collectively, and that is where everyone is living in this "we are doomed" stage. Yes, we are doomed for the short term because we've been complacent for too long. So here we are getting our hands slapped. We're in consequence circle. We're in timeout. And collectively, we have to like lick our wounds and be really humble and figuring out how we get organized. And then, we look to people like my overly optimistic boyfriend, who's a former politician and has ideas. And we look to people like Bernie Sanders right now is coming out with some great shit. You know what? It's all his old shit. He's just recycling it. And now people are starting to listen. Like, what the fuck? Marianne Williamson's doing the same thing. She's offering all sorts of hope, but we couldn't even listen to her 10 years ago, right? So we've got to find these pockets of hope and reformation, and that's part of the revolution that we need to focus on. Yeah. But we
It's
are
a reactionary revolution, and it's a little unfortunate because it's gonna, like you said, it's gonna get a lot worse before it gets better.
yeah, I think that's what it's going to have to take. Like, what was it? Heather was talking about these extreme polarity, right? But we need to have these extreme polarities for people to really go through their process of awakening. There's a collective awakening happening, but there's also a personal transformation happening pretty much on every level for people here on Earth. And if you've asked, has your life significantly changed? Pretty much everyone is going to say yes, unless they're living like in a tribal, Eastern, remote village somewhere. I don't know.
I'm sure some of the tiny, tiny parts of Middle America might not have changed too much.
So I want to switch over to Palestine. So, a number of U.S. intelligence agencies, and again, take this with a grain of salt because they lie all the time. They've claimed that Israel is planning to attack Iranian nuclear sites by the middle of 2025. So, Shireen, do you think this is just propaganda and hearsay or a real threat that should be taken seriously?
So it's it's a very good question. A lot of times there is a lot of back and forth, obviously posturing between these countries, and the people end up taking the hits for it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is, from the news that I'm hearing coming out of Iran, from the news I'm hearing coming out of Israel, from the news coming out of the US. It seems like that pressure is building, and it seems like it would only behoove Israel in the moves that they're making in the Middle East to take over that region to go ahead and have that influence over Iran. And um, we've seen the exiled prince meet with Netanyahu. We've seen him meet with a lot of Republican parties. It seems like they are trying to take over influence in the region, and by attacking their nuclear power, it would only disable them further. Any sort of nuclear, sites that they're going to attack. So it could just be psychological warfare, but it is a threat to them, and they have gone after the arms of the Iran, militia outside of Iran, which, they fund Hamas, they fund Hezbollah, they fund the Houthis. So all of these, parties now being distracted in their own regional wars leaves Iran open. So in some way, it is going to be some sort of an attack. And we've seen them attack those sites before in smaller scales. So I do think that there will be an attack. And I think it would be just to give that final kick while they're down, if you will, to then implement their own in place. From my understanding, what's happening right now, the conversation also is that Netanyahu is trying to pull Trump essentially into being okay with this attack and to be US backed. The conversation on Trump's end, of course, is always wishy-washy, as always is. First, he wants to put extreme measures on extreme pressure on Iran, and then it's not extreme pressure. We'll work with you guys if you work with us, and now this. So it's kind of very unhinged as our government is now, but again, it would be to their benefit in the long run.
Yeah, and I see a complete opposite response from Trump with Ukraine versus Israel. So, like, we're already trying to colonize Ukraine now. Trump placed a call to Zelensky demanding $500 billion of profits from rare minerals from Ukraine now belong to the United States. And then he doubled down and said that Ukraine started the war. um, but on the flip side of that, I don't see any scenario where Trump stops supporting Israel.
There's too much money in it for him. There's too much money and power, and that's at the end of the day, no matter what he says, that's what it's going to be. And a lot of Iranians were unfortunately writing on the fact that, there was that false dichotomy of, oh well, the Democrats have done nothing. It's all been talk, and Trump says he'll do something, so clearly he's going to do something and free us. And to this day, when I look at Iranian news from the diaspora, I hear all these, dissident politicians or journalists or whatever talking about how we just really need to appeal to Trump with a list of things that they can do to support us so that we can make it. There's still this disconnect, and I don't think people, the Iranian population that supported it, understand that if they do get any sort of action from Trump, it would solely be to do exactly what they've done with everything else in the region, to take over, take for themselves, and pocket the money essentially. And it has nothing to do with the people. So it's scary and it's sad.
Do you think that a wider war in the Middle East, involving all the current proxy wars, is imminent?
I think it depends on how long they stretch this out for.
Okay.
I think if this goes on for too long and their resources are depleted over time, I don't think so. But I think if they're moving at the rate that they are, yes. And I would be very interested to see how other geopolitical things come into play, because the US is trying to make amends with Russia, but Russia and Iran have a thing going. And, it's very chaotic at the moment. And I know that that's just how this administration and Trump work. But I'm curious to see if the war would come if they try to replace the administration in Iran in order to have more control. So I guess in a ways, neither scenario would be good if they do or don't. Because at one point it's basically like selling yourself from one master to another, the way that the US is treating these countries.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the main factor in deciding that would be a serious attempt by the US to implement regime change in Iran.
And they've got it kind of set up in the background. You have the MEK group that's a militant, very culty religious group that's been in the Middle East, that was kicked out of Iran, and they have been building resources and power and influencing a lot of politics in America. So trying to kind of do that background work to kind of get themselves in place should there be any sort of change. And then you've got, of course, got the exiled prince who's doing all of that work as well and shaking hands with Netanyahu. And I just can't possibly want the type of freedom for Iran after all of this time, which would be that kind of freedom, which is whatever would be dictated by either the US or Israel for Iran to do. That just, it would be devastating to think that all those children were fighting in the streets that were martyred so that we could have a 2.0 set in place, basically.
What do you think the end game is with Gaza? So Trump has said what his plans are. You know, he wants to finish it off and then start building resorts, put Jared Kushner in charge, his son-in-law. Um,
Such a
the
bad reality TV show.
Yeah, the rest of the Arab world is obviously like, fuck you, no, you're not. And really the rest of the world too. But is the rest of the world actually going to take action if Trump is serious about these plans? Because what I've seen from the majority of the Arab states is really just talk and no actual action.
Yeah, I think to some degree everyone has something to benefit in that region from not getting involved. And I think the the fact that there is money to be made is just really kind of like the main reason that they're going for those regions, obviously. And the um, I think the other countries won't necessarily maybe let it get to a certain point. Hopefully, you would hope, because I think they would know that if that happens, that they would be next as well. A lot of those countries have a lot of their own resources, are able to, have their own economies and produce within their own countries. I think the one thing that we in the US government has going against it is pulling all that funding from the different international sources that it controlled over time. So, I know the US has huge funding in the UN, different institutions like that. So pulling all that funding could be that silver lining that we need, because then maybe the people that are within those institutions that want to make some change would actually be able to get some movement. Otherwise, I think it's just posturing. I think you know we're going to see more European countries kind of jump on the fascist train, unfortunately. So it's going to be a bigger divide. So I'm curious to see, obviously, how it shakes out, but I think it's gonna be more division and less support. So maybe that war, that regional war you're talking about might be an effect of no one else supporting the Middle East, maybe. But at the moment, I see too much division for anyone to actually do anything.
Yeah, that's my fear too. Heather says they won't because they aren't against the concept, they're against Trump doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, you guys have seen Turkey constantly speak out against what's going on in Palestine. Meanwhile, they are literally bombing Kurdish people, destroying their indigenous land, literally setting it on fire. So they're doing their own ethnic cleansing. Meanwhile, they're like, "Oh no, American Israel, how dare you?" So it's really a lot of posturing. Unfortunately, they still benefit. A lot of those people in those governments in those regions are still ethnically cleansing and
Yeah.
really colonialist to their land.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
Totally. I was just in Turkey over the summer, and you just have this rise of let's just point fingers and put the distraction over there. The only country that's really advocating for Palestine is Ireland and South Africa. So we really don't have very many countries. The whole UN is silent about it. It's ridiculous. So this is why when we talk about the deep state, like when I first learned about the deep state, I'm like, oh, that's like the GOP party. And no, apparently the deep state is like all the Democrats. I'm like, no, it's actually both sides. So it's the same kind of thing that's going on here in Europe, where we have this hierarchical order of a bunch of dictators that are making their way, and they're nationally going through the ethnic cleansing. It's really happening. Yeah. And reducing the minorities. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just got really fired up.
When we talk about what the end game is with Israel, I mean, everybody's end game with Israel is to level it and build up. The question is who's going to do it. And when you talk about, like you read my comment in the chat, I mean, I don't think anybody's actually opposed to that concept, because it's clearly been, I mean, we've been talking about this since this started. What was it, October 7th, 2023? We've been talking about, and there have been tons of like posts on social media and on YouTube, and even like legitimate news articles reporting like this idea that Israel's plan was going to be to level it and build housing. And they've outright stated that. I think that just people are opposed to Trump doing it, and the US, because the US is, you know, we are no longer the world power that we were. And what's going to come with that is we are not going to just be able to waltz in wherever we want and take whatever land or minerals. Or, I mean, just this morning Zelensky said that he again wasn't going to give any minerals because he what was Trump trying to do? He was trying to say that he owed us the minerals because he owes us, but he said no, that money was a grant. I'm not giving you anything. We can't just walk our way in and take shit anymore, I think, because of
Well, yeah, and I
who.
think that's the ambitions of the administration, is to restore this old form of imperialism that was from
Yes,
like the Teddy Roosevelt era.
yeah,
And
I
do it
agree.
quick. Do it quick because people are catching on. The man behind the curtain's exposed and he's making eye contact with you. And, it's metal to the metal. Get it done now and restore that power. And I don't know if you guys have seen from before everything started, in not started, I should say, but, with October 7th, when that occurred, a few weeks before it, it was Netanyahu himself who was at the UN presenting maps of the regions that they could take, and their resources and the new trade route. And so it's a very clear, open conversation that's happening just amidst certain circles.
Yes,
So, if you have states that are colonialist states, like, Turkey, I mean, Iran was colonized by, the Islamists and then the regime and all of these different places. Like we say in America, if they acknowledge that, for example, Israel's a colonial state, et cetera, they would have to acknowledge it for themselves. Well, then Turkey would have to acknowledge that they're doing it. And, all these countries would have to acknowledge they're doing it. And if they support the full, you know, actions that the left wants to take, which is, you know, give land back, give resources to the poor, whatever it is, it would completely, show their hands too. And they would have to also do the same thing. So it's a lot of posturing, and it's really unfortunate. And the amount of hatred and violence that's going up now, um, is just is going to be really terrifying, because I see more people attacking, people that are affected by it directly, than actually attacking the systems that are doing this.
and I just want to emphasize also your point about the quickness with which this is happening now, because I think a lot of people, um, I mean, I thought that Israel was going to be very quick, back all the way back in October 2023. I thought it was going to go very quickly, but that was in an era, where Joe Biden was still the Biden administration, which moves incredibly slow. Biden is a known incrementalist, moves at a snail's pace. And so I think it couldn't go as quickly um, uh, as, probably Netanyahu would have wanted. Um, but now that Trump is in power, I think we're seeing a lot of different factions moving very quickly, because look at how quickly Trump moves. And I mean, he could do anything. I mean, every single day. It's like he's a chaos agent. And so I think the rest of the world has to quickly catch up to that, or, you know, lose the opportunity.
I agree, and I think they benefit from him being a chaos agent in so
Yeah,
many ways.
I agree.
The Democrats, the Republicans, they're all the same, like you were saying. There's that meme where it's like a recycling bin and a trash can in one, and it's got the two holes at the top, and you're reaching in, and it's really the same trash can. That's basically our government. And they're modeling it after all these other places, and you're seeing all these rights being taken away, and so many people are still stuck in, well, that's not legal, we can't do that, they can't, that's not legal, they can't do that. But I just don't understand why people aren't then saying, okay, well, it's not legal until it is, and it's not illegal until it isn't. Some people, it hasn't clicked yet. So I'm worried that it won't click quick enough, or as quickly as all these rights are being taken away.
Right, and I'll go back to a quote that I used yesterday in the panel. The road to fascism is built by people telling you you're overreacting.
Yes, I have apparently had a tinfoil hat on for years, you guys.
Hey, so not to interrupt and bring bad news, but I'm just looking at the early results to the German elections. Have you guys heard about this yet?
I
I
just
was
saw that literally like a
tracking
minute
it
ago.
a little bit before we jumped
Yeah.
on. But
Okay.
yeah, what's going on?
Do you want to know? I mean, let's finish up and then we can maybe end with that note because it's absolutely
Fuck.
a scare.
I'm already nauseous.
It's just that they've gained the AfD party, which is the far right extreme
The
party.
Nazis.
Yeah. They've gained so much spearheading over this last stint, these last few months, that it's complicating the matrix. So you've got 13 different parties or whatever it is. And right now it's a CDU. They're keeping a strong lead, and then AfD is at 20%. So the Conservative Party, the CDU, is the 29%, and AfD is 20%. And everybody else, the green is down. Everybody else is just not
And
even
there's so many young people that I've seen that are advocating for that shit in Germany, and it's really upsetting.
that's
Young
the
people
trend
here.
to
You
watch.
guys seen the videos that come out of like these young kids and young girls that are just Sieg Heiling left and right, and
Yeah.
proud to call themselves Nazis? And I saw it was in Houston, I think. There was an overpass where people had the swastika hanging, as well as a sign that said "Make America White Again." And
Yeah.
it's just the everybody feels so emboldened now.
Yeah, constant references to the 14 words.
We have a group here in Ventura County in California that has a monthly um, hanging of the swastika flag, the Nazi flag, over the freeway overpass. And what's so frustrating about it is that, to me, is that the resistance to it shows up with their little peace flags and their little peace posters and clutches their pearls and bitches about it in their letters to the editor in the local paper, but then they go home and they go back to brunch and they just they don't really actually organize around any kind of a meaningful local resistance to that. And because of that, the movement just grows. And okay, we're only one county and it's, we've got like less than 1 million people that live here, but I think that's representative of, what's going on across the entire country is the resistance is weak shit, for lack of a better, more eloquent
It
term.
is.
It's weak shit. I'm sorry, it is. So
It is. I mean, our Democrats are standing outside, buildings, videotaping people like
oh,
a
so
like a
embarrassing.
skinny dude, like blocking them. Meanwhile, in South Korea, people are climbing on top of each other for democracy. And then, here we've just done such a good job of turning anarchy, dissent, speaking out against things, violent riots or whatever. We've demonized it so much, and we talk about, oh, we're peaceful here, we're democratic, freedom, interpretive dance protest.
Yeah.
Okay, didn't that just happen though? I feel
Yeah.
like that just, oh yes, that did just
Yeah,
happen.
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's kind of like the propaganda that's been pushed. And we're too civilized to be violent. And look at all those violent people overseas. And we don't talk about the fact that, it's always been riots and violence that has actually gotten anyone any freedom, any movement. It's been going after people's money. It's not going to work. So until people realize that, I don't really know if we have much hope of standing up, because we can't even get people to do more interpretive dance protests. Even that's not happening that often.
Well, not even that. Not even violent. You're not even in the Democratic Party, as an example. You're not even allowed to meaningfully criticize policy. Like, you meaningfully criticize policy and you are blacked out of the we did an episode a while ago with, it was like spill the tea on the local Democrats. Remember when we did that with Aaliyah and
Yeah, that was so much fun.
and but the central point was just like, as soon as you start to even just express a remotely dissenting or different opinion from the party that wears t-shirts that say I dissent, as soon as you do that, you're the iron fist comes down, you're blocked, you're kicked out, you're blamed. I mean, look at even right now. I mean, it's like the Democrats had absolutely zero self-reflection. They still have zero self-reflection about what's going on. And they are trying to blame they're blaming college kids on campuses protesting a genocide of women and children.
Yeah.
They
That's
are
exactly
blaming
how it happened in Iran too, by the way. That's,
yeah,
yeah.
they are blaming that as the sole reason why Donald Trump, I mean, like, Jill Stein got like what, 1.2% of the vote, and they still are like, fuck you if you voted for Jill Stein. Like, what?
Third party. Do.
It's,
Hello.
the people that are asking questions are still not asking the right questions. That's upsetting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not even like, it's, I mean, it's not even an issue about, a violent uprising or withholding. I mean, I do see people starting to talk about economic blackouts later this month. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but, it's not even an issue of that. You're not even allowed to say, and that's when I started to realize that we are already in a fascist fascistic government, and it's both parties together and all of the organizers within it. Because when you can't even speak up without being kicked out, like,
Yeah, I mean,
that
think about all the Democrats that voted for the Lake and Riley Act.
exactly.
What I think is fascinating is that they managed to just weave this narrative for so long of, oh, we're the good guys, we're on your side, but it was just the seesaw all along, and it never actually went anywhere or did anything. But little by little, it just kept moving to the right and kept moving to the right. And now, to this day, people are still not aware that those rights have been taken away. They're still somehow not aware. And, you've got women that are surprised that they're getting laid off or that they're paying more bills because they thought or of those all of those laws and new policies weren't going to affect them directly, so they made those choices. But it's I think I just read, didn't they lay off a bunch of women and black people recently as well, intentionally? And you've got I think Trump was in Maine basically threatening them to do what they said or he would stop all their funding. So and that's just within like 2 days or one day. So it's going to be a quick slap in the face for a lot of people, I think, and they're going to be very, very surprised.
That's all I
Although they shouldn't be, right?
Right.
They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be, not only because of who Trump is, but because they have quietly sat by for the last 4 years and watched it happen in smaller degrees or in the private sector. And I keep thinking about the film strikes, because my husband is an editor and he is not union, but his company obviously works with the major studios that were on strike for the Actors Guild and the Writers Guild, and Hollywood just completely, was decimated by those strikes, and everyone sat around quietly as tens of thousands of working class people across Southern California lost their jobs. We're talking about like caterers, bartenders, dry cleaners. Those vendors all went out of work. And so I think those people are sitting here and like, well, yeah, look at everyone's still getting laid off, and now it's really public, but you were all silent while we were laid off. Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom, both our governor and the mayor of LA, were like, we don't want to get involved. We're going to let the unions do their job. Tens of thousands of people that had no union backup lost their jobs and have struggled since because the industry has not come back. And so it's interesting to see, well, on one hand, it's interesting to see people getting upset now, right? When it's been going on. But then it's also interesting to see the people who have been struggling all this time, like, well, we told you so. We told you it was just going
It's
to get worse.
upsetting though. It's not bringing people together, if you've
No, it's
noticed.
not.
People are saying, yeah, oh yeah, you didn't stand up for my fight. Well, screw you. I'm not standing up for yours.
Yeah.
It's the same
Right.
fight. I don't
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to get anywhere with vindictive revenge politics. We need solidarity and class consciousness.
Yep. It is interesting to see so many people that I know that were silent suddenly like realizing they aren't a part of the club.
How upsetting is that though? That you just spoke up because you realized you weren't the oppressor's favorite child.
Yeah, I posted on Facebook, I don't know, a week or two ago, about how I think it's so interesting that all of a sudden everybody is talking about politics again, and wow, everybody suddenly has an opinion, and oh my God, you realize what's been happening to people for the last several years. Crazy. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, like, where the fuck have you been?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've had a couple of random people reach out to me that never wanted to have the conversation, that would like not make eye contact when I talk to them about it, because I'm really fun at parties and gatherings. And then now they're like texting me or like talking to, have you seen what's happening?
Yeah.
Yes, I've seen what's happening. Have you? I don't.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like I keep thinking about the Hollywood strikes because I'm like, well, you were silent then. You're not silent now. I guess welcome to the conversation.
Wait,
Now
wait.
that it's stepping on your toes.
Somebody should do something about that.
Welcome.
Yeah, totally. What's happening? Tell me more. Sounds horrible. This whole time? No.
This seems bad.
Is it? How did this happen? How did we get here?
If
Did
only
anyone see
someone
this
had been
coming?
warning us this whole time. If only someone had said something.
I find myself laughing and crying simultaneously a little too much these days.
I know. Last night, my dad lives with us. He's actually in the room if you can hear him. But he last night he was like, you know what I'm getting sick of? I'm getting sick of the media saying, like, CNN, Jake Tapper keeps saying, well, Trump said that he was gonna do this.
I just want to flip my table over. You know what I mean? He's right though. What do you mean?
Yeah.
I saw somebody make a comment under, it was like the most like fascistic thing. I don't know if it was like the ICE one. I don't know which one it was, but this kid had actually written, and this is a testament to our education system right here. Guys, come on, give him a little time to fix it.
Oh gosh.
I was like, what? I'm sorry, what?
Oh boy.
Okay.
He throws some more kerosene on the fire.
Yeah, step back. It'll be fine.
Well, I do have to say, after 4 years of an administration moving so fucking slow to do anything, I I I guess I could give people a little bit of credit for thinking, um, uh, okay, well, maybe they're making mistakes, but they'll fix them. We just need to give them time.
But where are all the people that bought guns with the NRA
Yeah.
and were like, oh, the government's stepping on our toes? And where are all the people that were all lives matter? And where all the, you know what I mean? All of a sudden, a lot of people that said a lot of things are so quiet. and
Yep.
have nothing to say.
True.
Yeah, it's because they have no problem with authoritarianism as long as it's authoritarianism towards the left.
As long as it benefits them, right? That's the compartmentalization has to be like very specific for that to happen in their brains.
Right, and the bitter irony too is the vast majority of Trump and really Elon, because Elon's the president, um, the policies are largely negatively impacting Trump voters the most and people in red states as a whole. Because, like in California, in New York, the blue states that contribute the vast majority of the revenue to the economy, um, we are not nearly as reliant on federal funding as the poorer states are.
That's what's interesting is that they don't. A lot of people don't know the meaning of words. I've noticed in America.
Yeah.
So when people say things like tariffs or whatever it is, they just they hear, oh, illegal immigration. There's no reading. There's no follow up. It's just taken at face value, and then they just run with it. And they think, oh, illegal immigrants, and no one does any research on asylum or amnesty or the fact that they were never here to begin with legally. So it's this like lack of education, lack of reading, and like we said, critical thinking.
You know what, Jordan, to your point about the Trump voters being impacted the most, yesterday on our panel, I made a comment about how this, like, climate change and all of this climate fueled health impacts, like the bird flu and the COVID and heat illnesses and all of that shit, is happening at the worst time. But as you just said that about Trump voters and how people need to develop class consciousness a little bit ago, I'm actually wondering if actually this is the best time for climate change to be happening because people are being impacted in ways that they can no longer deny. And they're learning that they're not a part of the club very quickly. Like even multimillionaires in Los Angeles losing their homes, learning, oh, well, guess what? The government just fucked us over. Our insurance fucked us over. The government allowed our insurance to fuck us over. And now the federal government is saying we can't have any funds to help rebuild our home. And these are people that own multi-million-dollar homes. And so they're even starting to wake up. And so as I'm sitting here and we're talking about this, I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is the best time for shit to hit the fan because maybe then people will wake up because they're not going to be spared.
I would
I feel
agree.
that way about the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I would agree, especially because so many people are losing their jobs too.
Jobs, and then I also was saying this about flights the other day because I love to travel and I'm a little upset. And a lot of rich people are also not going to be traveling as frequently because they don't want their planes to.
They don't want to crash.
Right. So as soon as those people start getting a little stepped on, who knows?
Yep. No serious change really ever happens in the US until rich people and especially white people start getting impacted.
Which is why I was always so surprised that we did nothing about gun violence because all these white kids were getting killed in schools. That's how I really knew that, like, that's when it hit me. American government doesn't give a shit about its people. Like, you have white babies getting killed in schools and they're like, pew, pew, pew. So it's just, that really says a lot.
Yeah, and I could go on a full-on tangent right now about the missing white woman syndrome because I just watched the Gabby Petito documentary and
I just saw that.
the whole dynamic with the police and how they fucked that up, and like we're talking about ultimate white privilege, and even in that sense the cops completely fucked up everything. So
Useless.
really, like seriously, absolutely useless.
Well, you guys, there's something to be said about my mother. I was talking to her one day, and she's been talking to me a lot about the parallels with Iran and the U.S. because she's not as kept up to date with the U.S. version. And I was telling her how we're building all these cop cities in the U.S. and how exciting that is. And she was like, wait, so militarized units built in most states? I said, yes. So she goes, so to control everyone. Doesn't that sound a bit like what we had back in Iran? 'Cause we do have that. We have that exact thing. And I was like, nailed it, mom. There you go. And if my mom can get it, I believe other Iranians will hopefully soon too. And maybe Americans will wake up. But um, that Cop City is definitely a conversation that if you guys have again, I would love to be a part of.
Yeah, I actually have always wanted to do an episode on Cop City, so that's a good idea. I gotta get going. It's starting to get late here in Europe, and I have a long day tomorrow. But
Thank you guys. This was so much fun.
Yeah,
shout
thank you
out,
for coming on.
yeah, thanks for coming, Audra. Thanks for coming, Shireen. Shireen, shout out your plugs, your show, and anything else that you're working on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So the original channel that started broadcasting Freedom Hour on is WXOX, and that's where I'm on live every week. But of course, on Instagram, Freedom Hour Iran, and also my page, Shirin OH. There's a lot of different activism and intersectional activism, as well as some mural art and things like that that I like to partake in. So if you guys are ever wanting to be involved in that conversation or anything like that as well, I'd be happy to have those talks.
Thanks again for coming on. You're welcome back at any time. I'm glad that we
You
were
guys are
finally
amazing.
able to put this together.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been so pumped for this, so thank you.
Audra, shout out your Substack and anything that you're working on right now.
Yeah. My Substack is Audra White at .substack.com. I just completely spaced it. Steamy Mystic is the publication. So I'm actually working on paywalling a lot of my content because I quite enjoy the Substack platform because of censor-free experiences there, but the Nazis are there. So I have a big problem with it. And I've been very clear in my writings, being like, the Nazis are here, everybody, for over a year. And now now people are actually starting to write about it and take notice. But I'm over there on Substack promoting my work, less on Meta, and I'm on Blue Sky, which is the same handle as my Substack account, Audra White, substack.com. So
Beautiful. Thanks for joining the
thanks.
conversation. As always, the 805 Uncensored is on all the major social media and podcasting platforms. If you have any comments, guest suggestions, episode ideas, panel ideas, shoot us a DM. We'd love to hear from you. You can also email us 805uncensored@gmail.com. Thanks everybody for listening. Have a good morning, evening, wherever you're listening in the world. Stay safe out there. The revolution is you. Free Palestine. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks.